Greetings from Lord British. Many of you also have learned by now that my real name is Richard Garriott. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about the history of the Ultima series. I'd like to send my greetings, of course, first out to those of you who have been playing Ultimas now for 10 years. This is the 10th year anniversary of Ultima, and I would especially like to thank those of you who have been with me now for those many years. But also, of course, I'd like to extend my greetings and thank you to the new players, those for whom either this is their first or one of their first Ultimas played yet. Ultimas for me have been a very big part of my life, a very meaningful part of my life, and I hope that you will find the experience of playing them to also have some meaning for you. Like we said, this is now, of course, the 10th year of Ultimas, and at the ripe old age of 28, that puts it back at the age of 18, really, when I was first working on a series called Ultima. But, so you can understand how that's really been a major influence in my life as well, considering it has essentially consumed all of my adult life. I consider myself really quite fortunate for the many breaks which have fallen my way down through the years, but I'm sure you will also understand the great deal of work and effort which has gone into these games. For me now, after 10 years, Ultima is really more than just a game to me. It's very much a real part of my life. In many ways you can say Ultima has become my life. And the best way for you to understand that, which is one of the things I'd like to relate to you tonight, is for you to understand the influences and forces in my life that were taking place prior to the beginning of the series, and also to understand the evolution of the series as it's gone on. To get to the beginning of the Ultima series, you really have to go well before the publication of the first Ultima, and you really need to go back to my freshman year in high school. It was in my freshman year in high school that I was first exposed to computers, and very shortly thereafter, along with my exposure to computers, I was exposed to two other major forces, one of which was fantasy games, of course, like Dungeons & Dragons and Tunnels & Trolls, but also in the literary world, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And it was really those three things, which all three hit me at approximately the same time in my life, which really was the turning point of what began my progression into what has now become the long history of Ultimas. Through my high school career, the high school I went to really only offered one computer programming class, and so after taking one semester of the class, there was really nothing more you could do, and that first class was only in BASIC. Fortunately, however, I was a very active participant in science fairs at my school. In fact, I entered a science fair every year from my kindergarten year all the way to my senior year in high school. And it was through science fairs that I became very familiar with the faculty, and myself and two other students convinced the faculty that we had a strong enough desire to learn programming that they let us have a class to ourselves with no teacher, no curriculum. All we had to do was have a project that we were working on, and at the end of the semester they would look at our progress on the project and give us a grade accordingly. And so for the remaining 3 years of high school, I had as my project writing fantasy role-playing games upon the school's computer. During those 3 years, the remaining last 3 years of high school, I actually wrote 28 small fantasy role-playing games. Many of them, of course, were never completed, but really a fairly large number were. I'd say about 10 of those 28 actually made it through to completion and would run. And if you look at those programs, many of which I still have printouts of, or the paper tape, since I used to do my work on paper tape in those days, if you look at how those games operated, they have a very, very striking similarity to the modern-day Ultimas. The way they would work is, at first the player would type in a command, say, for instance, to move north, and what you would get is the teletype would then print out a new list of a 10 by 10 or so area around the player, where asterisks would be walls, and letters would be these four monsters, and little X's for doors, things of that nature, which, if you think about the way tile graphics and Ultimas work even today, there's a striking similarity. It was my senior year in high school, just after graduation from high school actually, that I went to work for a Computerland store selling computers, and was first exposed to the Apple computer. This was kind of the next big change, because the Apple computer, for the first time, as opposed to having a paper tape reader and 10 character per second teletype for printing it out, it had graphics. When I first saw the Apple, I was inspired by a game that I saw called Escape, which I'm sure very few of you remember back then. in 1979 or so. But Escape was a little 3D maze game. It was in low-resolution block graphics where you had to walk around through a maze and then you could eventually find your way out. Well, inspired by those three-dimensional graphics, I sat down and I said, hey, I can do three-dimensional graphics, but I can do it in high-res graphics and with the much more detailed line drawings. And I wanted to take one of these 28 games that I had already written over and over and over again. Really also, by the way, if it wasn't obvious through that period, that it was writing those games over and over and over again, which is the way that I taught myself to program. Well, I turned this around again, and I began working on one on the Apple. So I worked out, it took me really quite a bit of time, most of the summer after my sophomore year in high school, to work out what perspective view graphics could be worked like. I was a big geometry student. I had a lot of fun with geometry and didn't have quite so much fun with, but I knew trigonometry, and worked out mathematical perspective, put together a small fantasy role-playing game, and I called it Akalabeth. And Akalabeth, when I finished it, was really a game that I'd written for myself and for my friends to play, never really intending on having it published. But the owner of the Computerland store where we worked at said, hey, you really ought to publish that. And I don't know if any of you remember back then, but state-of-the-art packaging back in those days was a Ziploc bag and a cover sheet. And so I went out and I spent, at the time, what I thought was just an enormous amount of money, $200, to go down to the local print shop and had some little cover sheets printed up and like a 6-page manual, many of which actually I still have downstairs. I was just thumbing through those myself the other day. And copied a bunch of discs. Floppy disks themselves used to cost about $5 a piece for a blank disc when I used to have those. And so I copied myself up a bunch of them and started hanging them on the wall in the Computerland store where I was working. And my games at Akalabeth really looked just as high quality as any of the other games on the shelf, because the other companies that were just getting started back then, the Broder Buns and California Pacific, that was really the stage that they were at as well. Well, in the first week that I was selling those, one of approximately 8 copies that I sold during that first week found its way through someone who purchased it in Arizona, who then mailed it on to California to a friend of theirs, to a company called California Pacific. California Pacific, by the way, was the publisher for an individual named Bill Budge, who I'm sure many of you do remember. He's still active today. Bill Budge, in the late 70s, as far as I know, was the programmer. Bill Budge had 3 or 4 projects out, which I know I was a big fan of. I mean, if anything, I would have to say Bill Budge was my mentor of that era. Well, I got a call one day from California Pacific saying there were plane tickets waiting for me at the airport. So I flew to California and I signed a piece of paper and they started mailing me money. And that is literally exactly how I got into this industry. You could say very much accidentally, but also, of course, it's turned out to be very, very fortunate for me indeed. Well, that first project through California Pacific did very well. I mean, Akalabeth sold about 30,000 copies on the Apple.